As the fighting was coming to an end, as the different armed civilian groups had emerged as different clusters of armed reactionary civilians just to the direct west of the Brazos River Bend in the northwestern corner of the city of Waco and just slightly northeast, about a mile from the now recently captured and held Waco Regional Airport. These 450 armed reactionary civilians had been encountered by this light mechanized infantry battalion from the 3rd Light Infantry Regiment, who had already partaken in this battle against this large pocket of over 800 armed reactionary civilians, closer to 1,000. After that, they had gone down what became the China Springs Road from the ring road of 340/6, as 60 parts right here off the map, and 340 continues. As they had clashed with heavy artillery support and loitering munitions support, as well as utilizing their infantry fighting vehicles and their APC versions, which had a turret gunner with a 12.7 millimeter heavy W85 machine gun in place of this very high-tech turret with all these weapons systems aboard, including an anti-tank missile and the optics and the various ballistic computers and fire control systems and other important features. The APC version just had a simple turret and turret gunner, although the W85 could lay down enormous volumes of firepower, and each vehicle, of course, carried their squad of dismounts, typically 10 troops that could be dismounted and engage enemy forces. Although the armed reactionary civilians had carried out a few successful ambushes, including mostly one major success whereby they had eliminated a whole dismounted squad conducting a foot patrol away from their vehicle in an already captured area where they had come up out of a manhole cover, planted a device, and as the squad walked by, detonated it, and had immediately emerged, as it was a wire detonation, a tripwire. As they had emerged, they had collected as many weapons and ammunition as they could for said weapons before departing back down the manhole cover before another squad was able to come into the area and tend to the wounded who were still barely alive and perished due to blood loss, due to their maimed limbs and also severed arteries where some had taken shrapnel in the neck. As all had eventually been KIA'd from the ambush, they had taken weapon systems such as the light armor, anti-armor weapons like the Type 69 rocket-propelled grenades. They took a QJB light machine gun that had a high rate of fire. It was a squad automatic machine gun for the PLA, one of several types. And they also had basically taken these weapons to different parts of the city, as they had acquired 5 of them and also 15 rounds of ammunition for them, as well as the ammunition carried by the troops, the 5.8 by 42 millimeter ammunition for both on the belts for the QJB 201s and also the QBZ 95 assault rifles that the PLA commonly used, but they had other types as well. But they had taken these and they had utilized them in the defenses now unfolding throughout the city. And they were also found in downtown, such as this rocket-propelled grenade round being fired at this lead tank that is run into essentially a rubbled area after crossing this street here into this rubbled area that was a fortified area whereby these armed reactionary civilians were trying to put up a defense against the tank company, as this was a lead tank of the whole company, and also the lead vehicle of an armored infantry company moving through this area, as they were assaulting the main front lines in the downtown area that was a giant rubble heap by this point, as there was savage combat occurring everywhere. as the Americans had utilized the rubble to their best advantage and had turned them into fighting positions, as well as using their limited number of combat engineer vehicles from the tiny group of Americans that had made it just barely with their lives and some of their vehicles from a group of mixed military elements that had entered as they had escaped Fort Hood, and they had traveled into the downtown area. Although they were harassed by some loitering munitions and artillery, some of their vehicles and personnel had made it safely within the perimeter held by the troops of the 143rd Infantry Regiment, who were on guard in the downtown pocket and were putting up a hell of a struggle with a fairly large grouping of armed reactionary civilians of different stripes. Some were former military and actually had real gear like body armor and also possibly plate carriers, if not full body armor, as well as helmets and also their own personal firearms, which were usually sporting rifles, which were essentially very close to a military grade weapons and were good enough, as well as an assortment of other types of personal firearms, as the civilian and the caliber of the armed civilians varied from man to man. As the fighting was also involving not just the 143rd, but also some of the mixed military elements that had entered, 4 M1A2 main battle tanks from the previous 2 mixed up heavy companies had arrived safely with the mixed group of American personnel, as each heavy company from 49 Cav had 14 tanks, including the 2 that were part of the headquarters company, which were the command tanks, with 12 forming the combat platoons, as the 2 main groupings of the mixed up 2 heavy companies from 49 Cav were destroyed in a kill box in southwest Waco, which was what occurred right here, and also the rest having been destroyed in this particular area around Hewitt right here, just south of downtown. The rest of the forces that had made it were under heavy shelling, along with a group of armed reactionary civilians from the 152 millimeter artillery howitzers that comprised the artillery battalion of the 38th Infantry Brigade, who had already reduced large sections of Waco and elsewhere in the battle space in the metro area to complete abject total ruination with their 152 shells. In the same class as the 152 was the 155 shell, which was fired by the PCL 181s that equipped the artillery battalion of the 13th Light Armor Brigade, which was part of the 288th Light Infantry Division, which was essentially, for lack of a better term, their divisional artillery force, as the independent headquarters battalion over the entire division, encapsulating its command and administrative and some logistical elements, even military police, and also the mortar company to provide fire support to the mechanized infantry forces out in the field, as well as even their armored forces if need be. The forces that basically fired their 155 millimeter howitzers were firing at an array of different targets. They had started by firing at armed reactionary civilian elements that were being attacked in support of the 3rd Light Infantry Regiments, one of their battalions of light mechanized infantry, who had early on destroyed this pocket and this pocket after surrounding and destroying them with their subordinate companies, before shifting much of their fire off the map. However, they would be on call to shell the city if need be, although the city would be also heavily shelled by the towed howitzers of the artillery battalion from the 38th Infantry Brigade, as well as the rocket artillery coming from the 8th Independent Brigade right here, shelling the city with their multiple launch 122 millimeter rockets, as just one of these systems could saturate the larger portion of a grid square, which was a 1 by 1 kilometer area. An entire firing battery of these could saturate an entire grid square and beyond, and multiple firing batteries, like an entire battalion, could saturate multiple grid squares and lay waste to an enormous area with these rockets. However, even more powerful and larger and longer range than these were the 300 millimeter rockets of the Pssle-03 multiple launch 300 millimeter rocket system, which had an 80-mile range. The only system with longer range than that in the PLA's arsenal was the longest range artillery system on Earth in the form of the A300 rocket artillery projector, which itself was a 300 millimeter rocket system but fired a longer range rocket. It was the longest range artillery system on the entire Earth with a 187-mile range, which was one hell of a range, as a side note. As these forces, however, of the artillery battalions that were part of these different elements that were from the 68th PLA Group Army that were present and partaking in this battle, were firing in support of their ground troops as well as firing in a strategic level of shelling where they didn't just fire tactically to support their troops in the field, but they were also firing strategically to lay waste to the entire city and much of its industry, as they, along with cruise and tactical ballistic missiles fired from also the container-based systems like the YJ-18C and Caliber Club Ks, as well as the PLA 616th Strategic Missile Forces Brigade firing DF-11As, had laid waste to many of the defense contractors and their sites all throughout Waco, as well as doing enormous damage to large parts of the city in this way, as the splashes, as it's called, of these different ammunition types would saturate large areas with their blast radius, as the missiles alone carried enormous payloads, even the cruise missiles, which could produce, with modern explosive power, massive craters. And that's just the cruise missiles. That's not even counting the tactical ballistic missiles, which carried even larger payloads than did the cruise missiles. As now, the fighting in downtown was hitting a fever pitch by 5 a.m. with the arrival of the Russian forces, as the two battalions, one mechanized infantry battalion called an armored infantry battalion within the 16th Tank Division, as well as an armored battalion with their T-80 main battle tanks, which were a very well-balanced, very strong main battle tank, as mentioned before in previous installations, working together with the PLA's forces with their extremely advanced and potent Type 96B main battle tanks, which were excellent in terms of their engine, their armor protection, and the technologies employed within, as well as the weapon system being a 125 millimeter main gun, just like the Russian T-80 and also the T-72 B3M and also the T-90. As these forces working together, the Russian armored forces and armored infantry working together with the PLA armored battalions from the 8th Independent Brigade, of which there were two, as they consisted of 4 tank companies per battalion, and also 2 armored infantry companies and 1 anti-tank company, which operated the extremely powerful AFT-10s, which had 8 HJ-10 missile pods apiece, and could lay down enormous volumes of fire, with their headquarters and support company, which encapsulated their logistical and command elements per battalion. As these forces were now running into American defenses in the city, which were manned by armed reactionary civilians as well as military forces from the scattered remains of what was even left of the heavily battered mixed American forces that made it into the perimeter, protected by the armed civilians in the 143rd Infantry Regiment of the National Guard and Airborne Infantry Regiment. They were fighting for their lives, but they had used their brains and had made very intelligent decisions as to how to deploy their limited resources, including the few armored engineering vehicles that had made it within the perimeter that came from originally the 91st Brigade Engineering Battalion and now had made it into the perimeter and would be used to bulldoze and move rubble into fighting positions, as well as digging where there was soil that could be dug, such as areas where there were parks and gardens, to assist with preparing defenses there, such as dugouts and bunkers and trenches and foxholes and the entire 9 yards, as the saying goes. Rubble would be a massive fixture in the defenses, as well as manholes and sewers where men could escape underground from the enormous bombardments occurring above, or go into the parking garages, as they were multi-floor and were very strong concrete and steel reinforced structures that could take a heavy pounding and beating. And indeed they would, and many of them would lose their upper levels, pancaking in, as they would take enormous bombardment from the artillery and the rockets, as well as also the missile strikes that would come later, which would eventually destroy these structures, as they could not withstand all of these different strikes. But they lasted for a while, and the clearance for the vehicle entry afforded many of these military vehicles to be able to fit into these garages in the first place. As there were several of these located in downtown, they provided a getaway from artillery bombardment for many of the American vehicles, which would actually last quite some time. Although by later in the second day, when they would surrender, who was even left of the defenders, all of their vehicles would be destroyed, and very few would even be left lasting into the second day, as the bombardment from the different loitering munition strikes, artillery strikes, and air strikes from the combat drones, and also artillery strikes especially, including from the 300mm rockets that would come a bit later, as now it was 5 a.m. when the Russians were entering, and the first ZBL-03 strikes would begin at 6 a.m. after an hour of back and forth combat between armed reactionary civilians and also American military personnel that were holding their defense line along the Brazos River, as many strikes from cruise missiles and artillery had destroyed local bridges in the area, leaving only very few, like the Route 84 highway bridge from the 84 highway that was the same highway shown in certain previous battles from southwest Waco moving north and east into the city, northeast. As the fighting also now included these different elements of these battalions, as well as the Russians in the north of the city, as was being described, the light mechanized infantry forces were they who were holding the areas across the Brazos River, as they too had participated in previous battles in the north of Waco to capture and secure I-35 as their prime objective and directive, as well as also eliminating any and all armed reactionary civilian resistance, as by this point they were now facing down the defenders that were on the south side of the river bend, where the river actually had a fork where part of it came from Lake Waco and the other part of it was the Brazos River proper, as it flowed in a bend and then bent again as it gradually flowed to the southeast and away from the city. As it came through this area of Lake Waco, there was a river here. This is the Brazos River where it bent. It bent right here, and then there was a fork into the lake, and then there was another. This is the Brazos River as it flows southeast and out of the battle space. Well, this particular map is showing the standoff that had begun early on, as the battle that had occurred here in this area had led to the standoff, as this very battalion from the 3rd Light Infantry Regiment, after helping the battalion from the 14th subdue and destroy these forces in the North Waco area here, the companies from this very battalion of the 3rd right here had broken up and guarded points along the river as the bridges were out, but they wanted to secure the area, while they sent 3 of their other companies and a forward deployed platoon from their anti-tank company as they had 4 combat platoons and their headquarters platoon with 20 vehicles of their WZ-550 AT vehicles, or anti-tank vehicles. Their 4-wheeled anti-tank vehicles. They had sent them on the China Springs Road battle to interdict these fleeing Americans who could not cross and get into this area and who wanted to make it to I-35 and possibly use it to get away, or at least travel along it, as they had lost all GPS and navigation, and all they knew was that if they reached China Springs, they could take it to I-35 and try to flee the area, but they couldn't cross any bridges. They were stuck, and they had to take this route out. They were too afraid to go this way, as there were PLA forces known to be operating around the airport area. And as they had moved toward the China Springs Road, the 2 groups, which numbered 450, had been interdicted, heavily shelled, heavily loitering munitioned from the nearby headquarters battalion of the 38th, who supported the light mechanized infantry troops of the 3rd Light Infantry Regiment, which belonged ultimately to the 288th Light Infantry Division within the scope of this battle. As there were only 3 of the companies of the battalion operating in this battle with a forward deployed platoon from their anti-tank company, the rest of their forces were arrayed along the river, facing and holding their positions against the American defenders on the other side. As the main thrust into the downtown area would come from the various battalions of the PLA and the Russian battalions from the 16th Tank Division, who had pursued originally these American forces into the area but were coming up a bit late behind them, as the Americans had a head start and they were just entering the area and now would contribute to the fighting that was occurring downtown. As it had already begun initially with the PLA armored battalions moving into downtown, only to find that the heavily shelled area produced enormous rubble piles, which slowed down their advance, as is common in urban warfare situations. However, it wasn't something that couldn't be overcome. It was just something that had slowed them down drastically and that they would need to work around. And they also had their combat engineers, after destroying these forces here, move directly into this area, engage and destroy these armed civilians before moving in and helping form the line around downtown, along with the infantry battalion of mechanized infantry, also part of the 38th with the combat engineers. After this action had occurred, they had now moved into this area and held a line here. And the Russians were joining them as the armored battalion moved adjacent to it up I-35 and then to attack this corner right here, along with the armored infantry moving up and assisting the Chinese combat engineers and also mechanized infantry forces, which had moved into that area there. The armored battalions moving straight into this area here, along with the Russian armored battalion, and a mechanized infantry battalion, upon having cleared the area adjacent to I-35 with heavy artillery support from the rocket artillery before surrounding and destroying the remains of these armed civilians, moved into the area as well. So now this entire cordon from the Brazos River to the lake was fully secured by these very powerful elements of the PLA and also Russian 2nd Combined Arms Army from the Russian Army that had moved into the area from the 16th Tank Division of the Russian Army, 2nd Combined Arms Army of the Russian Army. They were assisting in the encapsulation and destruction of this pocket, which contained the 143rd and some of the active duty military elements from the Fort Hood installation from the American Army, and also armed reactionary civilians, which numbered essentially about 1,000, although some of these had been KIA'd by artillery as they fled madly to get into this area where they knew the 143rd was and was actually now holding out, and they were very blessed to find that out, that the 143rd was still hanging on. Its companies spread thinly, but with the assistance of the reactionary armed civilians in the area, they were doing some good in assisting in patching up some of the areas that needed defending, as the military personnel and armed civilians worked together to prepare defenses, while others stood guard and tried to fight off the steady attacks that were now a bit slowed down due to the conditions in the city from the heavy shelling. Many tens of thousands of civilians had died in the shelling, And also, thousands of combatants were now deceased as well, all throughout the city, as the outer areas had been cleared, especially down in the south, but also in the north. The last bit of fighting that occurred here had fully cleared the entire battlefield area, the whole Waco metro area, minus downtown, of armed combatants. They were all KIA'd, which numbered in the thousands, the low thousands. And now the rest of these forces, which between the 143rd and the nearly 1,000 armed civilians, plus the few hundred remaining still alive active duty Army personnel, were comprising roughly 2,400 personnel. As the 143rd was larger than about 1,000 personnel, it was originally a few thousand, but they had already lost 1,000 defending their perimeter against all of these attacking forces, loitering munitions, artillery strikes, which were enormous. And again, they had to be resourceful and go underground as often as possible to avoid being KIA'd by all of this firepower. It was immense. We go to the map of this local area where the river basically has a bend in it, as well as connects to the lake just off the map about a kilometer away. And this is a 1 by 1 mile area with the lake just off the map, again a kilometer away, with more American forces holding positions. The zoo hadn't been shelled yet. It was actually left alone. The Cameron Zoo, with the zoo buildings and trees and all that, they had turned it into a defensive area with sandbag emplacements. And the hill, this was on a hilly area overlooking the river, with this bank on a lower terrain with a slight hill where the street was on. Right here where it bends, this is a hill right here, a hilly terrain. The bridge had been taken out by artillery strikes here. Bridge had been taken out by artillery there. And cruise missiles were still coming into the downtown area, as again, in this type of conflict, the coordinates for targeting data could be updated with the container-based cruise missiles, and also missiles could still be fired from the strategic missile forces in Mexico, firing their long-range DH-10As, subsonic cruise missiles, or their DF-100 hypersonic cruise missiles, but most of those were saved for the most important targets. These were coming from the containers and had been changed to fly into the downtown area and hit specific areas that were suspected of being command and control centers. These strikes would occur in an hour from the PHL-03 battalion, who, after their victory, for the most part, at Fort Hood, they were now mopping up, which would take another 8 hours, but they had destroyed all the major combat units there, with only very scattered resistance remaining. As that was being cleaned up, the rocket forces were doing all their maintenance after their heavy involvement there. They were reloading and refreshing their systems. This is 84 right here. This is Highway 84, right on the edge of the lines here. And again, as I mentioned before, the Americans had access to a very small stock of anti-tank mines and also anti-personnel mines in the form of the Claymore. And they had set them up in certain areas, like on this street where this rubble is barely impeding it and a vehicle could actually go around here and assault this position, which had rubble moved from these destroyed buildings into the street to completely block it, and mines were placed in front to where the personnel could sit up on these rubble parapets and fire down to defend the minefield. But something had occurred. Although they had placed barricades here and had held these positions earlier, there was a ramp. There was an off-ramp from this lane of traffic as it moves north on 84 here. There's an off-ramp, but the PLA troops bounded across the street as they had moved up and taken these positions from the Americans. It was tedious work. This was regular mechanized infantry, not the light mechanized infantry that was holding the area across the river. Now, this was the regular, heavier mechanized infantry troops. And they were in their tracked vehicles, which they had left further back because of all the rubble and barricades in the streets, and they had sent their troops forward as dismounted squads to capture these rubble positions bit by bit with the vehicles staying back, providing fire support however possible, if possible, because of all the rubble choking the streets. This is a few squads, some medics, and some NCOs and a few platoon leaders in the mix here. And what they had done was, after they had captured this area, there's still more defensive lines and positions, as all the rubble had been moved into the streets and the mines planted whenever they could. As they had a limited supply, they had to deploy them intelligently. They had moved up this off-ramp here from the highway, and these were damaged or destroyed vehicles that were rolled into the way to block this highway from enemy personnel coming across the river. And these troops went up in two squads and lined up along the southbound lane right here on this side of the highway, the southbound lane here on 84, which connects really close to I-35 right here. They were firing down now at these personnel that were guarding these rubble-strewn areas where they had dug in and used it as fighting positions, just using the rubble as simple fighting positions, but they had all taken the time to arrange it in specific ways to make it more survivable. Like, they made little rubble dugouts and bunkers that they could hide in. And now they were exchanging fire upwards at these PLA troops on this highway, and also downwards at the PLA troops that were doing the same thing as these personnel. And a long, drawn-out firefight ensued between these mechanized infantry dismounted forces, as loitering munitions, as some had already impacted in the rubble areas, taking out a few personnel, but not a whole lot because of the defenses being so rugged. They were still coming in, and they had hit in certain areas and KIA'd a grouping of mixed personnel. These were some armed reactionary civilians and a few of the troops from the Alpha Company of the 1st Battalion of the 143rd that were intermixed with them. Some of them had anti-armor weapons like AT-4s. There were anti-tank and machine gun nests here. It was a well-built-up defense. This green thing here with a line coming out, this is a dugout. This is like a bunker with a machine gun nest. It's a machine gun nest bunker that was dug into the ground, and it was basically covered up with sandbags, earth, rubble, and it was on the end of this rubble pile, and it was in this grassy area. They had dug in a foxhole. They had some personnel behind it laying down in the prone that could fire over the men in the foxhole, who could then pop up and fire too. They were a little higher up on the prone position than the men in the foxhole, as the terrain gradually slightly goes down in elevation before a steep drop toward the river below. And this is sandbag emplacements in the zoo, in the Cameron Zoo. These are all like the zoo buildings here and everything. Zoo parking lots and downtown parking for the zoo. They had made large sandbag emplacements also adjacent to the buildings. They had made a machine gun nest here out of one of these zoo structures, and they had put up sandbags around it and made it fortified and put a machine gun in there, a 240 Bravo, overlooking the river. And these bridges, again, had been taken out that cross the river, the Brazos River, and go to other parts of the city that were across the way. Here's a gas station. Here's some former larger homes. There's some small businesses, and others like a fast food place. All of this had been badly gutted and hit by artillery earlier before these troops moved in and took over. There's Americans attempting to come out of a manhole cover over here and conduct an ambush, and they come around the corner, but they've already been spotted by quadcopter assets flying around the area from these headquarters troops patrolling. And this Tiger MRAP with a W85 12.7 millimeter machine gun and these dismounted headquarters troops, they light these guys up. And this house is basically Swiss cheese, along with all these personnel that came out of the sewer. News had spread fast once that improvised device attack had occurred, and these troops were already on high alert. They were expecting the worst. They all had their quadcopter recon assets flying over the area, but most of the combat elements had theirs over here, monitoring the activities over here. This is a CH-4A, one of the high-altitude recon drones, and it's firing down now It's anti-tank missiles. They're CM502 KGs instead of the HJ-08s that they can also carry. These are the dual-purpose anti-ship, anti-armor weapons, which are very powerful. They fired them at this sandbag emplacement right here, two of them, which completely annihilates this and all the personnel coming out of this manhole cover. This is right after a major artillery attack had flattened all of this part of the city. These buildings were basically all that was left in the area. These two were gutted badly, but this city block was spared for the time being. This building badly gutted. The zoo was spared for the time being. You know, the PLA didn't want to just destroy a zoo unless there was a reason to, but then they came out and fortified it because it was adjacent to the river, the Cameron Zoo. Over here, too, this area was like a park. They made 2 machine gun emplacements and dug in a massive trench between these streets where they crossed the river. Did another trench over here. These men are laying behind a slight embankment. Loitering munition comes in, along with heavy fire. This is a drainage ditch that comes from a small business area. This runs underneath the parking lot, goes through here, goes through this way, and empties out into the river. This is a fast food place. This is another small business, like a store. It could be any kind of store. And this is a street that goes past these parking areas for the zoo and everything else. And these areas have been totally flattened, and all the rubble turned into fighting positions on each and every city block. But it was about to be heavily rocketed momentarily. But first, loitering munitions had come in and KIA'd all of these personnel, but it took 3 loitering munitions to do it. These were all armed with heat warheads, not just because they anticipated firing at heavy armored vehicles, which there were a few left, but they had wanted to use it against rubble piles and fortifications, which these were the perfect implement for that. The HE would have been good as well, but the heat could penetrate certain things that the HE just couldn't. And these all came in and annihilated this grouping of about 20 personnel in this particular city block rubble pile. Now, over here, there were a few MRAPs, Max Pro MRAPs, and they were coming up the street through these gutted and still surviving buildings here. And as they reach the end here, they're being fired at by the infantry fighting vehicle, the ZBD-08, or ZBL-08 rather, with its Gatling 35mm autocannon with armor-piercing ammunition and its anti-tank missile, its HJ-73C, which has an almost 2-mile range, has over a 1-mile range, it's almost 2 miles. It fires an anti-tank missile and destroys one of these, and also is firing its 35mm armor-piercing HE ammunition, which just shreds the hell out of these MRAPs, too. And, I mean, even the carcass of the other one that was destroyed by the AT missile is getting shredded up. This is a technical that flew into the area at the opening of the map and dropped off 5 personnel from the bed of the truck as it flew into the area, but it too is being engaged by heavy machine gun fire, 35mm autocannon fire from the infantry fighting vehicles. As over here was a forward deployed anti-tank platoon, and also over here was another forward deployed anti-tank platoon of the WZ-550 anti-tank vehicles that belonged to the anti-tank company within the battalion. There was a full combat platoon present here and another here, with a third off the map. And over here, there was a few of the anti-tank vehicles here. There was another one here, and the other 2 of the platoon were off the map and down the street. And there was a full platoon of vehicles here and part of a platoon here, and more off the map down the street. As the 2 dismounted squads that were in the drainage ditch were taking fire from across the river right here, they too were in a drainage ditch using it as cover with their heavy machine gun fire coming from their vehicle-based fire support platform, which was its turret gunner, basically firing its W-85 heavy machine gun at these forces. As you can see, the red is around the trench. The trench is being engaged. These 2 machine gun nests that were painstakingly dug and built and fortified with sandbags are each hit by a CM 502 kg, which goes right through them and annihilates them from the inside out, just blasts them up out of the ground. Although these men keep their heads down as they see the missiles fly in and nothing happens to them. But these two missiles that hit this area completely wreck this sandbag emplacement and KIA all these personnel coming out of this manhole cover and going this way to move to their positions, being destroyed by the two missile strikes, which heavily also damage and wipe out some of the personnel here, as indicated by the arrow with the red on this side and this red right here and around the sandbag nest. Some are safely behind the sandbags as the blast emanates, I mean, it's a relatively large blast, but not too large to where it goes all the way across the parking lot, but the shrapnel still affected this and cut a few of the men down. And again, this technical had been shredded up by infantry fighting vehicle fire. The infantry fighting vehicles were also firing at these trenches as well. And with this loitering munition coming in and hitting enemy targets off map, these vehicle-based fires are coming in and wiping out this squad of troops right here, this half squad of troops, as well as these troops right here. There were some KIA'd off map from the loitering munition. These rubbled fighting positions here, which used to be city buildings and city blocks, they're getting hit, they're getting pelted heavily by armor-piercing HE ammunition from the 35mm Gatling autocannons on the infantry fighting vehicles. They're also being fired at by heavy W-85 machine guns. This is a long exchange of fire between the personnel in the trenches and in these fighting positions in the rubble former buildings. There's a long exchange of fire going on, and the small arms fire is really doing nothing whatsoever at all to these vehicles, but the vehicle-based fire is seriously damaging or destroying all of the vehicles present and also damaging severely the machine gun nests and buildings in this area too, and wiping out a lot of these personnel coming up out of this manhole to take their positions here. A lot of them are being KIA'd, a lot of them, by the heavy machine gun fire and 35mm fire, and the small arms fire coming from the troops are wiping out some of the personnel, along with loitering munition strikes. This sandbag was hit by 35mm fire and loitering munitions, including right here, these personnel coming by this fence that separates the zoo from this area right here. Now, the troops over here were being KIA'd by a combo of loitering munition fire coming from the vehicles across the way, including anti-tank missiles fired from the HJ-09 base WZ-550 systems, the WZ-550 wheeled vehicles, four-wheel anti-tank vehicle with 4 anti-tank missiles apiece. The HJ-09s, they're firing in support of their troops, and the troops are supporting the vehicles, mutual support, firing anti-tank missiles into these rubble piles, as well as over here at this fighting position, this machine gun nest on the edge of this rubble pile. This is like trench rubble systems. And the vehicle-based fires going through these areas here that used to be larger homes, as well as vehicle-based fire from here. This exchange of small arms fire, including coming from the troops on the top and from the bottom level, firing at these personnel, and managing to KIA quite a few of them, as you can see. A lot of those surrounded in circles here have all been KIA'd, surrounded in the red. All of these personnel are KIA'd. Over here, completely KIA'd. Those in these machine gun nest fighting positions, completely KIA'd. There's personnel here hit by the loitering munitions behind the line of contact, all KIA'd. And of course, personnel in this area too being KIA'd as the fire is heavy. There's personnel that are holding this area too that was adjacent to these mines they planted, anti-tank and anti-personnel mines. The PLA troops can see all of that. They just don't approach it yet. They're going to get their combat engineer robots to dismantle that at a later time. But as this fighting goes on for an hour as the PLA troops from their side of the battle get drone support, not just for their fire, but also when looking south. From their perspective, they're firing anti-tank missiles at these rubble positions, at these forces that are well dug in. The loitering munitions are assisting them in KIAing some of them, too, that are holding this position along the riverfront. They're going to fire new batches of loitering munitions. They had already used some that had already KIA'd personnel earlier. These are just the personnel that have come back up out of hiding from either in the sewer systems that are running back to their positions after the last barrage. As so here, as they move up into this area, they're being KIA'd by the fire from the vehicles, personnel, anti-tank platoon vehicles moving into the area. And there's also the very small-scale ambush that was attempted against the headquarters platoon troops, as these are lighter non-combat troops. These were the logistical and command and administrative elements over the entire battalion. But, I mean, over the entire company, not the battalion, a company smaller, but they were the platoon over this company. And they had completely shredded them up with their MRAPs, which were pulling security around the weaker vehicles like the armored recovery vehicle, the fuel truck, the covered trucks for supplies and logistics, and the command vehicles. They just shredded these guys up. They fired and peppered this house with heavy machine gun fire from their 12.7 millimeter machine gun as they had come from across the street just off the map from a manhole cover and went around this area. But their quadcopter recon assets patrolling this area had spotted them, and they had machine gunned them as they were coming around that home and had wiped them all out. As the barricades that were rolled into the way of destroyed or damaged vehicles or abandoned vehicles here had meant to slow these PLA troops down that could easily enter the highway, and it would slow them down a bit as there were a lot of these abandoned cars from the highway that accrued over time of the battle. These forces went around this ramp and just sent dismounts up to provide overwatch and fire down into these personnel while these troops fire straight at them. When they use their rocket-propelled grenades, they use their 35 millimeter grenades, they use their hand grenades from up here, they use their light machine guns, general-purpose machine guns, as occasionally they carried those as well, which fired larger rounds like the 7.62 by 54 millimeter. And they also fired their occasional anti-tank missiles down at the personnel, as some of the troops carried those as well, the HJ-08s. And it caused enormous damage, but the rubble was so thick in some areas that it really did provide excellent cover from all kinds of destruction. Even loitering munitions, as they could go into some of these makeshift ad hoc bunkers that were created and hide down in there while loitering munition came in and struck. And although the loitering munition could penetrate certain types of rubble, sometimes the rubble was actually enough. And this gutted building was even used by personnel too, but it would soon be destroyed as 155 millimeter and 152 millimeter artillery would strike this area here, and this area here, and here, while bigger rocket artillery like the 300 millimeter strikes would come in these areas here and off the map, as you can see right here. This is a 300 millimeter strike, more off the map. And these would wipe out a lot of personnel between the howitzer and major rocket strikes. But still, many would be in some safe positions as well as going underground and escape the massive bombardment, which would engulf the area, only to emerge and return back to their positions. The same as troops were doing in the parking garages, which were off this map and in other parts of the downtown area, as the entire downtown battle will actually be explored in more videos, as there is more to come on this large-scale operation now that the Americans were surrounded. and were being thoroughly liquidated, although instead of the previous rapid actions that had occurred due to the tempo of operations now being forced upon both the defender and attacker due to the conditions present, like all the enormous rubble created from the massive artillery strikes, the presence of combat engineers that could manipulate said rubble with their equipment that they still had left, the fact that the parking garages protected some vehicles could be used at such a capacity. There were many factors that determined how long and how intense certain battles were. America was being introduced to high-intensity warfare, as it had gotten far too used to low-intensity conflicts and had a boutique military force that was not prepared for a high-intensity war. This was unbridled high-intensity warfare, and America would have to learn to live with it. Even in the insurgency phase, America would lose horribly, but they would never give up. And that was what mattered. It was about continuity of resistance. As the PLA was a mighty force, the most powerful military force on the face of the earth ever seen in human history, with the war industry and just industrial base in general backing that up, as well as the largest population, only tied with India in that case. But they had the most STEM graduates on earth: science, technology, engineering, and math. And they literally put every other nation to shame, and that's why they led in 37 of the 44 critical military technologies, with Russia eating up much of the difference. And also, China was exceedingly wealthy, with the biggest gold holdings on the face of the earth, biggest real economy, biggest military industry, biggest aggregate of military hardware, both in their active duty service as well as stored away for their reserve and paramilitary forces. It was gargantuan. Numbers that many people don't like to cover because it's actually quite horrifying, as the implications for having such massive amounts of hardware implies that in a conventional war, any opponent will simply be swamped by such a massive number of weapons and platforms. The battle in Waco would continue and would get more and more savage as the 300mm rocket systems were introduced into the mix and would throw rubble around, even more so than the howitzer artillery and 122mm rockets already did. There would also be more missile strikes from cruise missiles, as targeting data would be updated on some of the container-based YJ-18Cs or Caliber Club K systems. Also, a few more tactical ballistic missile strikes as well to support the troops operating in this particular theater of operations. As Waco was a stubborn nut to crack, but it would be cracked. In this particular battle space here, the troops were simply just holding the outer cordon. Their mission was to hold it while the other troops stormed their way in, looking south as the battlefield. This was the north and this was the south, as the heavier forces were coming in this way and from the south. The light mechanized infantry forces would hold their sector and would tie up a lot of American defenders here, as they would gradually wither them down, as this was their mission. While the heavier, very potent strike forces came in from the east and south and would shred through, by day 2, the defense lines. Again, 4 days was a rapid amount of time to overthrow a nation of America's vast size, but with a few exceptions, a few cities and areas holding out for a few days, some rarely longer. The invasion would exact a small cost on the invaders, but over time they would begin to lose tens of thousands of troops as the years passed, and the Americans began to get better and better weaponry, get better organized, get better tactics, learn to communicate in a primitive environment, and learn how to pre-plan their operations and stick to them so that they would have a higher degree of success against such an enemy force as the PLA. And also their allies, to some extent, but mostly the PLA, as it was quite obvious why they had contributed the most troops, because they had the biggest forces under arms. 20 million paramilitary of the different paramilitary branches, all combat trained and graded and armed. Biggest active military and massive ready reserve force of 5 million. 29 million men under arms. That's why China kept so much hardware and upgraded it over the years while adding massive amounts of new hardware. They had an enormous force to equip. And did they equip it? Hence the invasion occurring with this level of force. Next battle will explore the introduction of the Russian forces into the fight in the portion of the downtown line near I-35, which was the corner, the southeastern corner of the line in downtown. Whereas this is the northernmost cordon along the Brazos River, including where the river comes through this area, as these bridges had been taken out by artillery strikes and in some cases missile strikes as well elsewhere along the river. Battle will continue in the next video of this hypothetical invasion documentary series showcasing fourth generation warfare doctrines.